Sarah Martinez never imagined that her morning jog through the military training grounds would change her life forever. The 28-year-old nurse lived in a small house just outside Fort Harrison, where her husband Mike served as a communications officer. Every morning at 6, she would run the same 3-mile route that bordered the base, enjoying the peaceful sunrise and fresh mountain air. That Tuesday morning felt different somehow. Dark clouds gathered overhead and the wind carried an unusual tension. Sarah had been running for about 20 minutes when she heard the unmistakable sound of gunfire echoing from the training area. This wasn't unusual. The soldiers practiced combat exercises regularly, but something about the rhythm of the shot seemed wrong, more urgent and chaotic than the controlled drills she was used to hearing. As she rounded a bend in the path, Sarah saw smoke rising from behind a cluster of trees about 200 yards away. Her nursing instincts kicked in immediately. Where there was smoke and gunfire, there might be injured people who needed help. She left the jogging path and pushed through the underbrush, following the acrid smell that grew stronger with each step. The scene that greeted her was pure chaos. A military transport vehicle had overturned after hitting what appeared to be an improvised explosive device during a training exercise. The truck lay on its side, black smoke pouring from its engine. Sarah could see at least 3 soldiers scattered around the wreckage, but her attention was immediately drawn to a young man trapped beneath the vehicle's rear wheel. The soldier couldn't have been more than 20 years old. His uniform bore the name Rodriguez, and he was conscious but clearly in severe pain. His left leg was pinned under the massive tire, and blood was seeping into the dirt around him. He was trying to call out to his fellow soldiers, but his voice was weak and getting weaker. Without hesitation, Sarah sprinted toward the overturned vehicle. The other soldiers who weren't injured were working frantically to help their wounded comrades, but none had noticed Rodriguez trapped beneath the truck. The vehicle was precariously balanced, and Sarah could see that any wrong movement might cause it to shift further, potentially crushing the young soldier completely. She reached Rodriguez and immediately knelt beside him. His face was pale and covered in sweat, his breathing shallow and rapid. Sarah recognized the signs of shock setting in. She had seen similar injuries during her years working in the emergency room, and she knew the time was running out. The weight of the vehicle was cutting off circulation to his leg, and if they didn't get him free soon, he could lose the limb or worse. Rodriguez looked up at her with frightened eyes. He was just a kid, probably someone's son who had joined the army to serve his country. Sarah placed her hand on his shoulder and spoke in the calm, reassuring voice she used with patients in the hospital. She told him her name, explained that she was a nurse, and promised that she would get him out of there. The smoke from the vehicle was getting thicker, and Sarah could smell gasoline. She realized that the truck might catch fire at any moment, which would make the situation even more dangerous. She looked around desperately for something she could use as a lever to lift the vehicle, but there was nothing suitable nearby. The other soldiers were still busy with their own rescue efforts and hadn't heard her calls for help over the noise and confusion. Sarah made a decision that would haunt and define the rest of her life. She positioned herself at the rear of the overturned truck, placed her hands under the frame, and began to lift with every ounce of strength she possessed. The vehicle was incredibly heavy, probably weighing several tons, but desperation and adrenaline gave her power she never knew she had. Inch by agonizing inch, she managed to raise the truck just enough to relieve some of the pressure on Rodriguez's leg. The young soldier immediately began trying to pull himself free, but he was too weak and injured to manage it on his own. Sarah knew she couldn't hold the weight much longer. Her muscles were screaming in protest. Her back felt like it might snap, and her vision was starting to blur from the strain. She called out to Rodriguez, telling him to use his hands to push himself backward while she held the truck. Together they worked frantically to free his trapped leg. Sarah could feel her strength failing, but she refused to let go. This young man's life depended on her, and she would not let him down. With one final desperate push, Rodriguez managed to pull his mangled leg free from under the truck. The moment Sarah felt his weight disappear from beneath the vehicle, she tried to step back and lower it safely, but her body had reached its absolute limit. Her muscles gave out completely, and instead of stepping clear, she stumbled forward just as the truck came crashing back down. The edge of the vehicle's frame caught Sarah across the back of her head with tremendous force. The impact was like being struck by a sledgehammer. She felt a brief moment of searing pain, saw bright flashes of light behind her eyes, and then everything went black. Her last conscious thought was relief that Rodriguez was safe. Sarah's unconscious body crumpled to the ground just a few feet from where Rodriguez lay, gasping and crying. The young soldier had witnessed everything. Despite his own injuries and pain, he began screaming for help, pointing toward the woman who had risked everything to save him. His voice finally cut through the chaos of the training accident, and other soldiers began running in their direction. Sergeant First Class Williams was the first to reach them. He was a 20-year veteran who had seen combat in 3 different countries, but the scene before him left him speechless. A civilian woman lay unconscious and bleeding, having apparently lifted a multi-ton vehicle to save one of his soldiers. Rodriguez was clutching Sarah's hand and repeating over and over, "She saved me, Sergeant. She lifted the whole truck. She saved my life." Williams immediately called for medical assistance and began checking Sarah's vital signs. She was breathing but unresponsive, with a significant head injury that was bleeding profusely. Her pulse was weak and irregular. The sergeant had seen enough head trauma to know that this was serious, possibly life-threatening. He applied pressure to the wound while shouting orders for soldiers to clear a landing zone for the medical helicopter. Within minutes, the training area was swarming with military personnel. The base commander, Colonel Peterson, arrived by jeep just as the medevac helicopter was touching down. Williams quickly briefed him on what had happened, but the colonel was having trouble believing the story. A civilian woman had single-handedly lifted an overturned military vehicle to save a trapped soldier? It seemed impossible. But as more witnesses came forward, the story was confirmed from multiple sources. Several soldiers had seen the final moments when Sarah freed Rodriguez, though none had been close enough to help in time. The physical evidence was clear, too. Sarah's fingerprints were on the truck's frame, and the pattern of dirt and debris around the vehicle showed exactly where she had been positioned. As the medical team worked to stabilize Sarah for transport, Rodriguez refused to be treated until he could tell everyone what she had done. Despite his injured leg and obvious pain, he insisted on giving a detailed account of her heroic actions. He described how she had appeared like an angel when he thought he was going to die, how she had spoken to him with such kindness and confidence, and how she had literally lifted a truck with her bare hands to save his life. The helicopter lifted off with Sarah aboard, rushing her to the trauma center at the regional medical facility. Colonel Peterson followed in his staff car, already beginning to understand that something extraordinary had occurred on his base that morning. As he drove, he was on the radio with his superiors, trying to explain how a civilian nurse had risked her life to save one of their soldiers. Back at the accident scene, the investigation was already beginning. Military police photographed everything, measured the position of the vehicle, and interviewed every witness. The more they learned, the more remarkable Sarah's actions appeared. The truck weighed nearly 8,000 pounds. Even with adrenaline and leverage, what she had accomplished should have been physically impossible for someone of her size. Word of the incident spread quickly through the base. Soldiers gathered in small groups, talking in hushed tones about the woman who had lifted a truck to save Rodriguez. Many of them knew Sarah by sight from her morning runs. She had always waved and smiled when she passed soldiers during their own training runs. She was just a friendly neighbor who happened to be married to one of their communications officers. But now she was something more. In the space of a few minutes, Sarah had transformed from an ordinary person into a symbol of courage and selflessness. The soldiers were already referring to her as a hero, though none of them yet knew whether she would survive her injuries. The medical reports from the helicopter were not encouraging. Sarah had suffered severe head trauma and remained unconscious. As the hours passed, more details emerged about Sarah's background. She had been working as an emergency room nurse for 6 years, specializing in trauma cases. She had saved countless lives in the hospital, but always as part of a medical team with proper equipment and resources. What she had done that morning was different, a single act of pure courage performed without thought for her own safety. The story reached beyond the base when Rodriguez's family arrived at the hospital. His mother, tears streaming down her face, kept asking to thank the woman who had saved her son. She wanted to know everything about Sarah, wanted to understand what kind of person would risk their own life for a stranger. The answer, she was told, was simply a good person who saw someone in trouble and couldn't walk away. For 3 days, Sarah remained unconscious in the intensive care unit. The doctors were cautiously optimistic about her chances for recovery, but they warned that head injuries were unpredictable. She might wake up completely normal, or she might face long-term complications. Her husband, Mike, barely left her bedside, holding her hand and talking to her constantly, hoping that somehow his voice would reach her through the darkness. During those 3 days, something unprecedented began happening at Fort Harrison. Word of Sarah's heroic actions had spread far beyond the base. Local news stations picked up the story, then regional networks, and finally national media. The image of a small woman lifting a massive military vehicle to save a trapped soldier captured the public imagination. In a world often filled with negative news, here was a story of pure heroism and self-sacrifice. But the most profound reaction came from within the military community itself. Soldiers from Fort Harrison began visiting the hospital, not just to check on Rodriguez, who was recovering well from his leg injuries, but to ask about Sarah. They brought flowers, cards, and small gifts. Many of them had never met her personally, but they felt a deep connection to someone who had risked everything to save one of their own. The story reached the Pentagon, where high-ranking officials were trying to determine how to properly honor a civilian who had performed such an extraordinary act of courage. There was no existing protocol for this situation. Military decorations were reserved for service members, but Sarah's actions clearly deserved recognition at the highest levels. Committees were formed, precedents were researched, and discussions continued around the clock. Meanwhile, soldiers at Fort Harrison were organizing something on their own. Without any official direction from command, they began planning a tribute to Sarah for when she woke up. It started small, with Rodriguez's squad wanting to visit her as a group to express their gratitude. But the idea quickly grew as more and more soldiers asked to participate. Sergeant Williams, who had been first on the scene, became an unofficial coordinator for the tribute. He understood better than most what Sarah had done, having seen the physical impossibility of her achievement with his own eyes. He had served in combat zones where he had witnessed acts of incredible bravery, but what Sarah had accomplished was different. She had no training, no equipment, no support, just the determination to save a life. By the end of the second day, Williams realized that their simple tribute had evolved into something much larger. Soldiers from every unit on the base wanted to participate. Officers and enlisted personnel, seasoned veterans and new recruits all felt compelled to honor the woman who had shown such courage. The base commander, Colonel Peterson, gave his full support to the effort, understanding that this was something his soldiers needed to do. As word spread beyond Fort Harrison, soldiers from other military installations began asking if they could participate as well. The story had resonated throughout the armed forces, touching something deep in the military culture of honor and sacrifice. Sarah represented the best qualities that soldiers aspired to: courage, selflessness, and an unwavering commitment to helping others, even at great personal risk. On the morning of the third day, Dr. Jennifer Hayes, Sarah's neurosurgeon, noticed the first encouraging signs. Sarah's brain activity was increasing, and she was beginning to respond to stimuli. The swelling in her brain had decreased significantly, and her vital signs were stabilizing. For the first time since the accident, Dr. Hayes felt confident that Sarah would not only survive but likely make a full recovery. Mike was sleeping in the chair beside Sarah's bed when he felt her squeeze his hand. It was barely perceptible but unmistakable. He immediately called for the nurse, who confirmed that Sarah was indeed beginning to wake up. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and confused but definitely conscious. She tried to speak but couldn't form words yet. Mike leaned close and whispered that she was safe, that she was in the hospital, and that Rodriguez was alive and recovering. Within an hour, Dr. Hayes confirmed that Sarah was out of danger. Her cognitive functions appeared to be intact, though she would need time to fully recover her strength and coordination. The news spread quickly through the hospital and back to Fort Harrison, where soldiers had been maintaining a constant vigil for updates on her condition. When Sarah finally became fully conscious late that afternoon, she was confused and disoriented. She remembered running, remembered seeing the accident, and remembered trying to help Rodriguez, but everything after that was blank. Mike gently explained what had happened, how she had lifted the truck to save the young soldier, and how she had been injured in the process. Sarah's first question wasn't about her own condition or her injuries. She asked if Rodriguez was okay, if he was going to keep his leg, if he was in pain. When Mike assured her that the young soldier was recovering well and would make a full recovery, Sarah finally relaxed. Only then did she ask about her own situation and what the doctors expected for her recovery. As evening approached, Dr. Hayes decided that Sarah was stable enough to receive visitors. Rodriguez had been asking to see her every day since the accident, desperate to thank the woman who had saved his life. When he was wheeled into Sarah's room, still recovering from surgery on his leg, both of them began crying immediately. Rodriguez could barely speak through his tears. He thanked Sarah over and over, telling her that she was an angel, that she had given him his life back. Sarah, still weak and emotional from her ordeal, simply held his hand and told him that she was glad he was safe. It was a moment of pure human connection, two people bound together forever by a few minutes of terror and courage. But neither Sarah nor Rodriguez knew what was being planned for the next morning. Outside the hospital, Sergeant Williams was coordinating the final details of a tribute that had grown far beyond anything originally imagined. The morning sun had barely risen when the first soldiers began arriving at the hospital. They came quietly, parking their vehicles in designated areas and forming up in the parking lot with military precision. Sergeant Williams had spent most of the night coordinating with hospital, security and administration to ensure that their tribute would not disrupt patient care or hospital operations. Sarah woke up feeling much stronger than she had the previous day. The headaches were manageable now, and her vision was clear. Dr. Hayes had told her that she might be able to go home in another day or two if her recovery continued at this pace. Mike was already there with coffee and her favorite breakfast from the hospital cafeteria, such as it was. What Sarah didn't know was that soldiers had been arriving at the hospital since 5 in the morning. The parking lot was filling with military personnel from Fort Harrison and 3 other nearby installations. They came in dress uniforms, standing in perfect formation despite having no official orders to be there. This was entirely voluntary, a grassroots tribute organized by the soldiers themselves. By 7 o'clock, there were over 200 soldiers assembled outside. Hospital staff members kept glancing out windows, amazed by the sight of so many military personnel standing at attention in their parking lot. The hospital's public relations director had been notified about the planned tribute, but even she was surprised by the scale of what was developing. Sergeant Williams checked his watch and radio. More soldiers were still arriving, including a contingent from a base nearly 3 hours away who had driven through the night to participate. The tribute had taken on a life of its own, growing through word of mouth and social media into something unprecedented. Williams had never seen anything quite like it in his 20 years of service. Inside the hospital, Dr. Hayes was making her morning rounds when she stopped by Sarah's room. She found her patient sitting up in bed, looking remarkably well considering the severity of her injuries just days earlier. Sarah was asking when she could return to work, eager to get back to her normal routine as an emergency room nurse. Dr. Hayes smiled and told Sarah that her recovery was progressing excellently, but that she would need to take things slowly for a while. Head injuries required patience and rest, even when the patient felt ready to resume normal activities. She also mentioned that there seemed to be quite a bit of activity in the parking lot, though she didn't elaborate on what was happening outside. As the morning progressed, the number of soldiers continued to grow. By 9 o'clock, there were over 400 military personnel assembled in formation. They represented every branch of service and every rank from private to colonel. Officers stood alongside enlisted personnel, veterans of multiple deployments next to soldiers who had just completed basic training. The local news media had gotten word of the gathering and were setting up cameras at a respectful distance. This wasn't a planned media event, but rather something organic that had emerged from the military community itself. Reporters were struggling to understand exactly what was happening, interviewing soldiers who spoke with deep respect about the woman they had come to honor. Colonel Peterson arrived at the hospital at 9:30, accompanied by his command staff. He had been monitoring the situation throughout the morning, and while he was proud of his soldiers for organizing this tribute, he was also somewhat overwhelmed by its scope. Nothing in his military experience had prepared him for managing a spontaneous gathering of this size. The colonel made his way to Sarah's room, wanting to personally thank her before the formal tribute began. When he knocked on her door and introduced himself, Sarah was surprised but pleased to meet him. She had heard Mike mention Colonel Peterson before, but had never expected to meet such a high-ranking officer personally. Colonel Peterson explained that he was there to express the gratitude of his entire command for what Sarah had done. He told her that her actions had inspired not just his soldiers, but military personnel across the entire region. He also mentioned that there were quite a few people outside who wanted to thank her personally, though he was careful not to reveal the full extent of what awaited her. Sarah was touched by the colonel's visit, but she remained humble about her actions. She insisted that she had simply done what anyone would have done in the same situation. She had seen someone in danger and acted to help them. Nothing more. The colonel smiled at her modesty, recognizing the quality that had driven her to perform such an extraordinary act of courage. As 10 o'clock approached, the final preparations were being made outside. The soldiers had arranged themselves in precise formation, creating lanes and open spaces that would allow Sarah to move through their ranks when she was ready. Hospital staff had prepared a wheelchair for her, understanding that while she was recovering well, the emotional and physical stress of such an event might be overwhelming. Sergeant Williams received confirmation that Sarah was ready to come outside. Dr. Hayes had examined her one final time and cleared her for the brief outdoor ceremony, provided that she used the wheelchair and didn't overexert herself. Mike would accompany her along with Rodriguez, who had insisted on being there despite his own injuries. The elevator ride down to the main floor seemed to take forever. Sarah was nervous about what awaited her outside, though she still had no idea of the true scope of the tribute that had been organized. Mike held her hand reassuringly, while Rodriguez sat in his own wheelchair beside her, equally emotional about what was about to happen. As they approached the hospital's main entrance, Sarah could hear voices outside, not loud or boisterous, but the low murmur of many people gathered together. Hospital staff members lined the hallways, many of them having adjusted their schedules to witness this unprecedented event. Even they seemed to understand that they were about to see something extraordinary. The automatic doors of the hospital slid open, and Sarah was momentarily blinded by the bright morning sunlight. As her eyes adjusted, she began to make out shapes in the parking lot ahead of her. At first, she thought she was seeing things incorrectly. There seemed to be rows and rows of people in uniform, all standing perfectly still and facing in her direction. Mike wheeled her forward slowly, and the full scope of the tribute became clear. 500 soldiers stood in perfect formation across the entire parking lot and surrounding areas. They represented every military installation within a 3-hour drive, and they had all come voluntarily to honor her actions. The sight was breathtaking and overwhelming. As Sarah's wheelchair emerged from the hospital entrance, something magical happened. Without any verbal command or signal, every single soldier came to attention simultaneously. The sound of 500 pairs of boots clicking together echoed across the parking lot like thunder. Then as one, they raised their hands in salute, a gesture of respect and honor reserved for the most significant occasions. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth in shock. Tears immediately began streaming down her face as she realized that this incredible display was for her. She had never seen anything like it, never imagined that her simple act of helping someone could inspire such a response. The sight of hundreds of soldiers standing in her honor was both humbling and deeply moving. Colonel Peterson stepped forward and began speaking in a voice that carried clearly across the assembled formation. He explained that these soldiers had come from multiple bases, representing thousands more who couldn't be present but who wanted their gratitude expressed. He spoke about courage, about the difference between those who talk about doing the right thing and those who actually do it when the moment demands action. The colonel's words were formal but heartfelt. He described how Sarah's actions had reminded every person present of why they had chosen to serve, of the values they swore to protect, and of the civilians they had dedicated their lives to defending. He said that while they were trained warriors, Sarah had shown warrior spirit in its purest form, protecting others without regard for personal safety. Rodriguez was then helped from his wheelchair by 2 fellow soldiers. Despite his injured leg and the obvious pain it caused him, he insisted on standing for what he had to say. His voice was stronger than it had been in days, powered by emotion and gratitude that went beyond words. He told the assembled soldiers about those terrifying moments under the truck, about thinking he was going to die, and about the angel who appeared to save him. The young soldier's testimony was raw and powerful. He described watching Sarah position herself under the massive vehicle, seeing her face contort with effort as she lifted weight that should have been impossible for her to move. He spoke about her calm voice reassuring him even as she was performing an act of superhuman strength and courage. As Rodriguez spoke, many of the soldiers in formation were wiping away tears. These were hardened military personnel, people who had seen combat and faced danger as part of their profession. But Sarah's story touched something fundamental in their understanding of heroism. She hadn't been trained for this, hadn't been equipped or prepared. She had simply seen someone who needed help and acted without hesitation. When Rodriguez finished speaking, he turned to Sarah and saluted her with perfect military precision. Immediately, every soldier in the formation followed his lead. 500 hands rose in unison, holding their salutes as a mark of the deepest respect the military community could offer. The silence was profound and sacred, broken only by the sound of flags snapping in the morning breeze. Sarah tried to speak but found that words wouldn't come. The overwhelming emotion of the moment, combined with her recent head injury, left her speechless. Instead, she placed her hand over her heart and nodded to the assembled soldiers, acknowledging their tribute with grace and humility. The ceremony continued with several other speakers, including a general who had flown in specifically for the event. Each person who spoke emphasized different aspects of Sarah's heroism: her quick thinking, her physical courage, her willingness to risk everything for a stranger, and her humble response to the acclaim that followed. But perhaps the most moving moment came when the formation began to break up and individual soldiers approached to thank Sarah personally. They came in groups of 10 or 20, each taking a moment to shake her hand, express their gratitude, and share what her actions meant to them personally. Many of these soldiers had families of their own, children and spouses who worried about them when they deployed. They understood that Sarah was someone's wife, someone who had her own life and responsibilities, yet who had chosen to risk everything to save one of them. That knowledge made her sacrifice even more meaningful. A young female soldier, barely out of basic training, knelt beside Sarah's wheelchair and explained that she had joined the army to make a difference in the world. She said that Sarah's example showed her what that really meant, not grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but simple acts of courage when they were needed most. An older sergeant, a veteran of 3 combat deployments, told Sarah that he had seen many acts of bravery in his career, but that what she had done was different. She had acted purely from compassion, with no training to fall back on and no support to rely on. That, he said, was the truest form of courage he had ever witnessed. As the individual meetings continued, Sarah began to find her voice again. She thanked each soldier for their service, for their willingness to protect others, and for organizing such an incredible tribute. She insisted again that she had simply done what felt right, what any decent person would have done in the same situation. The tribute continued for nearly 2 hours as soldiers from every unit present took their turn to personally thank Sarah. Hospital staff had never seen anything like it, an endless stream of military personnel, each taking a moment to express their gratitude to one small woman who had risked everything to save a life. Even the medical workers found themselves deeply moved by the sincerity and emotion displayed by these tough soldiers. As the formal ceremony began to wind down, Colonel Peterson approached Sarah with a special presentation. He explained that while civilian awards were limited, the military community had found a way to honor her actions appropriately. He presented her with a specially commissioned plaque that bore the signatures of over 1,000 soldiers from multiple installations, all expressing their gratitude for her heroism. The plaque itself was beautiful, crafted from polished wood and brass, but its true value lay in what it represented. Each signature belonged to a service member who had been inspired by Sarah's story, who saw in her actions the embodiment of the values they fought to protect. It was a tribute from the entire military community, acknowledging her as one of their own despite never having worn a uniform. Rodriguez, still standing despite obvious discomfort, made one final presentation. With tears in his eyes, he removed his own military challenge coin, a symbol of pride and belonging within his unit, and pressed it into Sarah's hands. He explained that this coin represented brotherhood, honor, and the bond between soldiers who had shared danger together. He wanted her to have it because she had earned her place in that brotherhood through her actions. The young soldier's gesture sparked something unexpected. One by one, other soldiers began approaching Sarah to present their own challenge coins. Sergeants, lieutenants, captains, all ranks were represented as soldiers offered their most treasured possessions to honor her courage. Within minutes, Sarah's lap was filled with dozens of coins, each one representing a personal connection to the military community she had served through her heroism. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah was exhausted but deeply fulfilled. The overwhelming show of respect and gratitude had touched her in ways she was still trying to understand. She had always known that military families formed tight bonds, but she had never expected to be welcomed into that community with such open arms and heartfelt appreciation. Dr. Hayes, who had been monitoring the ceremony from a distance, approached to check on her patient. She was amazed by Sarah's resilience and by the positive impact the tribute seemed to have had on her recovery. The emotional support and recognition appeared to be providing healing benefits beyond what any medication could offer. In the weeks that followed, Sarah's story continued to spread far beyond the military community. She received letters from across the country, from people who had been inspired by her example of selfless courage. Schools invited her to speak to students about the importance of helping others. Community organizations wanted to honor her with awards and recognition. But perhaps the most meaningful ongoing relationship was the bond she formed with Rodriguez and his family. The young soldier's recovery was complete, and he returned to active duty with renewed dedication to his service. He credited Sarah not just with saving his life, but with showing him what true heroism looked like. They remained close friends, with Rodriguez often saying that he owed everything to the angel who appeared when he needed help most. Sarah eventually returned to her work as an emergency room nurse, bringing with her a deeper understanding of courage and sacrifice. Her experience had shown her that heroism wasn't something reserved for special people in extraordinary circumstances. It was a choice that ordinary people could make when faced with someone in need. The military challenge coins became treasured possessions, displayed proudly in her home as reminders of that incredible morning when 500 soldiers stood to honor her deed. Each coin represented not just gratitude but acceptance into a community bound by shared values of service, sacrifice, and protection of others. Years later, when people asked Sarah about that day, she would always redirect the conversation to Rodriguez and the other soldiers she had met. She insisted that the real heroes were the men and women who chose military service, who deployed to dangerous places and made daily sacrifices to protect others. She had simply done what anyone should do when they see someone in trouble. But those 500 soldiers knew better. They understood that true heroism often comes from the most unexpected places, from ordinary people who make extraordinary choices in moments of crisis. Sarah Martinez had lifted more than just a truck that morning. She had lifted the spirits of an entire military community and reminded them why their service mattered. The story of the nurse who saved a soldier became legend within military circles, passed down through generations of service members as an example of the civilian courage that makes their own sacrifices worthwhile. It became a reminder that heroism exists everywhere, waiting for the moment when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things for others. And somewhere in a small house near Fort Harrison, a collection of military challenge coins sits in a place of honor, each one representing a soldier who was touched by an act of pure courage and wanted to ensure it would never be forgotten.